Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Have imposed it only on tax measures. They don't require quorums, if we want to call it that, to elect the governor or to elect the president of the United States or to do anything else in this democracy. I think if they were sincere about that principle, they would say, let's apply it across the board. And unless 51% of the American people turn out in a presidential election, we should declare the office vacant.
Sorry. I'm Ray Polanyi, City Club member. It seems to me I'm very much in favor of the recommendation of the City Club for a yes vote on Measure 53. It seems to me that money is important in our society, in any society. It fuels untold needs and services required by a civilized society, and citizens should be involved. Citizens should vote. Money measures are an incentive to vote and should remain such an incentive. In the words of the committee, a no vote would reward non-participation in the democratic process by giving a veto power to voters who choose not to vote at all in elections to decide certain property tax issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, hearing no further debate, I just want to ask all of you to consider these points that have been raised today. Consider the committee's report. If you haven't read it, please do so prior to the election. If you need extra copies, we do have some copies in the tables here. If you need extra copies for your friends or associates, call the club office, or you can get access to the report on the City Club's website, which is found at www.pdxcityclub.org for a full text of the report. Well, thank you for Charlie and to the members of the committee for your fine work. Now we'll go into the second half of our program. Our program today is made possible in part due to the generous underwriting from the law firm of Miller Nash, Weiner, Hager, and Carlson, U.S. Bank, and Legacy Health Systems. Don Williams, business manager with the Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt law firm, will have his board host hat on today, and he'll ask the first question of Dean Leebron. Our speaker today is David Leebron, who's professor of law and dean of the Columbia University School of Law. He'll talk about innovative approaches which Columbia has taken to deal with affirmative action issues and avoid the backlash of being accused of unfair preferences. The Columbia Law School student body remains widely diverse. Other law schools where affirmative action programs have been cut back or eliminated seem to be reverting back to class profiles which haven't been seen since before I was a law student back in the early 70s. This is particularly true in California as a result of Proposition 209. It's resulted in minorities at the law school at Berkeley going down by 80%. For undergraduate students at Berkeley, in a single year, minority admissions went down by over 50%. A recent Oregonian column mentioned that the debate about affirmative action is like the debate about admission of women to the Citadel. The Citadel is supposed to be a training ground for military officers, but while the U.S. Armed Forces in which these officers would be serving has long ago promoted women into more active roles, the Citadel would not even accept them in their doors. It makes you wonder what is going on. Now, David Leebron has had a chance to think about these issues for a long time now, and in his present position has a chance to do something about it. He received undergraduate and law degrees from Harvard University, and he's been active in performing research and teaching on international law issues. In 1996, he was elected by the faculty of Columbia Law School to the dean position, but he continues to teach to the extent time permits. Given how busy David Leebron is, we're certainly very fortunate to have him with us today to speak on affirmative action. Dean David Leebron.
It's a great pleasure to be here in Portland. My only regret is that I have to fly back east this afternoon. And I'm deeply honored and privileged to be able to speak today with the City Club of Portland and other guests. Now, I've been asked to speak on perhaps one of the most difficult and controversial topics of our time, affirmative action. It's frankly a topic on which many have urged me not to speak out too much because one doesn't really want to invite a lot of attention. I want to stress at the outset that I am not an expert in the law of discrimination or anti-discrimination, including the law governing affirmative action. That's not my field. Rather, I've been asked as the leader of a preeminent law school to talk with you about some of our experience in achieving a diverse faculty and student body without compromising our high standards for quality. Law school admissions have figured prominently in the debate about affirmative action and the resulting legal cases. Now, I don't want to begin with details and methodology, but with perhaps an emotional reaction to the results of our policy. And I want to add, our faculty think Columbia Law School is just about the most exciting educational environment we can imagine. Our students are extraordinarily bright and engaged. They are smart, articulate, provocative. They are committed and ambitious. They come from most states of the country and over 40 countries. Nearly half are women and over 1/3 members of minority groups. Their politics span the entire spectrum. Their religions and cultures are equally varied. When we discuss an issue in class, I never know quite what to expect, except for talent. This result is not randomly achieved. It is achieved through rigorous admissions process that looks not merely to the individual's claims of merit, but to what we as an institution seek to accomplish and contribute. It is hard for many of us to comprehend that this extraordinary environment, which we have so carefully nourished, is now under systematic legal attack. The basic claim, of course, is that affirmative action constitutes racial preferences, and whatever the value of diversity, it cannot be sufficient to justify such racial preferences. There can be no doubt that racial preferences in which candidates are preferred solely because of their race are objectionable and illegal. But as I hope to explain, affirmative action is not a racial preference, nor is it a quota. It is and should be an attempt to engage simultaneously in individualized decisions while in pursuit of a broader institutional mission. Let me suggest some of the questions that I think are important here and seem not to be at the forefront of the current debate. First, with regard to private institutions, and Columbia University is one, the question we need to ask is to what extent the government will be allowed to define the appropriate goals, procedures, and policies of those institutions. This country has from the beginning been built by the positive contributions of private institutions, both profit-making and non-profit. Our understanding has been that the government role should be limited and justified clearly in terms of helping those who have not fared well in decentralized private decision-making. The related concerns concern what are we going to replace such private decentralized decision-making with? Do we have a clear conception of, quote, merit in each of the relevant contexts? Is that simply some score on a standardized test? Is that how we are going to force charitable institutions which steward valuable resources to dispense those resources? Finally, can we justify in that context the use of a standardized test which is not race neutral? There are clear differences between various ethnic groups on the LSAT and other standardized tests. The tests are very useful, but they could also become pernicious if schools are forced to slavishly accept those results to determine who they will admit. The end of the current litigation concerning affirmative action may not simply be eliminating the LSAT or GPA differentials between ethnic groups in law school and other admissions, but rather rejecting these bases of admissions in favor of criteria that are far more subjective. Perhaps a bit of legal background would be useful. At issue in cases challenging affirmative action are either or both the United States constitutional provisions which provide for the equal protection of the law, primarily the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, or in the case of private actors, anti-discrimination laws such as Title VI and VII that prohibit discrimination on the basis of race in employment and education. At the Supreme Court level, the affirmative action debate began with a now little-known case arising out of the University of Washington in the mid-1970s. The Supreme Court did not resolve the issue there for procedural reasons. In 1978, the Supreme Court addressed the question of affirmative action in the Bakke case, which originated in the University of California's admissions policies. The issue was controversial then, as it is today, and the justices were badly divided, with no justice writing an opinion which commanded the support of a majority of the court. Justice Powell, who delivered the court's opinion, or decision, I should say, wrote an opinion which upheld the principle of affirmative action pursued either to redress past specific discrimination or to achieve a diverse student body. Justice Powell put emphasis on the value of academic freedom and how diversity might serve that value, which, although not specifically protected in the Constitution, had long been of concern under the provisions of the First Amendment. And although Justice Powell did not speak for a majority of the court, indeed, he technically spoke for no other member of the court, his role both as the swing vote and deliverer of the opinion led that opinion to be interpreted in many instances as the statement of the prevailing law. It is this resolution in Bakke, which appeared to bless affirmative action, that has been under attack in recent years. This blessing of affirmative action was extended to the private employment context in 1979 in the case of Weber versus United Steelworkers. The Supreme Court in the last decade or so has acted decisively, though often by a 5-4 margin, to strike down affirmative action in a number of contexts. The court has outlawed race-based set-asides or preferences in government contracting, for example. Increasingly, it appears to insist that race not be a part of either governmental or private decision-making, although it has not issued a categorical statement to that effect. It has suggested that race-based classifications be restricted strictly for remedial settings. Against this background, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit 2 years ago struck down the University of Texas Law School's program in a case called Hopwood versus Texas. The Texas program was an unusually transparent one, which relied upon an index score based on a combination of an applicant's LSAT score and undergraduate GPA to determine whether the applicant would be presumptively admitted, fell within a discretionary zone to be considered more thoroughly, or be presumptively denied admission. These grids were different for whites, blacks, and Mexican Americans. There was also some evidence, although not entirely clear, that the law school in Texas sought to achieve a certain numerical representation of these groups. Within the discretionary zone, the black and Mexican American applications were reviewed by a separate minority subcommittee, so that in effect there were separate decision-making tracks as well as different standards. Finally, the law school maintained separate waiting lists for majority and minority candidates. In short, the Texas program was an especially vulnerable one because of its somewhat rigid use of scores in its process and the segregated quality of some parts of its procedure. If the court in Hopwood had limited its decision to striking down those aspects, it would not have had such a major impact. Instead, the court went well beyond the necessary confines of a decision and ruled more broadly that, quote, any consideration of race or ethnicity by the law school for the purpose of achieving a diverse student body is not a compelling interest under the Fourth Amendment, thus rejecting the Powell opinion in Bakke as controlling law. Several months after the decision in Hopwood, California adopted Proposition 209, which prohibited any preference based on race. Although literally Proposition 209 was not without its ambiguities, the California universities have applied it vigorously to reject admissions policies which would allow for differential scores in standardized testing. The results of both Hopwood and Proposition 209 are well known, especially for law schools. In both cases, black students in particular were virtually absent from the entering classes at Texas and Berkeley. The Supreme Court was about to get back into the affirmative action debate in a New Jersey case called Taxman versus Piscataway. Although the name is Taxman, I'm glad to report in light of today's discussion that the case had nothing to do with taxes. The court had agreed to hear the case, but then, very surprisingly, the case settled. Taxman might have been a very important decision, since it presented the issue under a statute that governed private employers, even though the defendant in that case was actually a public school district. On the other hand, Taxman involved the kind of preference that the Supreme Court has clearly rejected, namely a racial preference in the context of employee layoffs. More recently, the University of Michigan has been sued, and anti-affirmative action measures have been introduced in Congress and placed on the ballot somewhat to the north here in the state of Washington. Although Hopwood itself is limited to state schools, it is likely at some point the policies of private educational institutions will be challenged under federal statutes. Now, from the somewhat parochial point of view of these private law schools, it is important to emphasize that even Hopwood leaves the law quite unsettled. We continue to believe that the Supreme Court's decision in Bakke and some of the reasoning articulated there in defense of diversity by Justice Powell is the prevailing law, and that under that law, the pursuit of a diverse class is a permissible institutional goal. There is no major decision holding that affirmative action programs at private educational institutions violate the law. Many scholars believe that under current law, the constitutional standards that govern public educational institutions will also be applied to private institutions under federal statutes. But it is not beyond question that the courts will draw a distinction between the two types of institutions. As I suggested, the issues are, I think, very different. And I think we should be very cautious about forcing private institutions into certain modes of admissions decision-making. This does not mean that any and all means of pursuing a diverse student body are acceptable, even by such private institutions. The problem with the affirmative action debate is that the hot-button terms used, such as preferences, are so devoid of agreed meaning. Affirmative action itself means everything from a bit of effort to generate interest among potential minority applicants to quotas. Pretty much everyone, with some exceptions, agrees that efforts designed to encourage interest in applications from minority members are permissible, especially if such applicants are underrepresented in the applicant pool. On the other hand, quotas are now general and bad policy, again with perhaps a few dissenters. The question is where on the spectrum of approaches the line of legality should be drawn. Much turns not only on such definitions, but also how we phrase the questions. Putting the issues in such hot-button terms tends to confuse rather than clarify the questions. And that indeed has been the intent and practice of those sponsoring some of the ballot initiatives. For example, when surveys ask whether the interviewee favors race-based preferences, the answer is overwhelmingly negative. On the other hand, a survey that simply asks whether the interviewee supports affirmative action generates a generally positive response. Let me turn now for a bit to our approach to admissions at Columbia. Our basic methodology is to carefully consider each and every application, to consider it together with the entire pool in light of our previous experiences, and to ask the basic question of what will the applicant contribute to the school and ultimately to our society. We seek a group of applicants not talented along any one dimension, but along several. We apply no rigid rules other than that we seek the best student body both for our own educational environment and the contribution that we, as one of the premier institutions of legal education, can make to the world. We believe that the students learn more from each other than from us, though we try to keep that secret. And our admissions policies reflect that. As my admissions director likes to say, we do not merely select an entering class, we compose it. And to students concerned about the high tuition, I tell them that to be able to spend their time intensively with the group of people who will be their classmates is alone worth $25,000 per year, and we're willing to throw in the formal classroom instruction for free. Our admissions process is not race-blind in the sense that students may, if they wish, identify their racial and other background. In the America of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, race is undeniably an important element both of one's experiences and perspectives and the contributions one is likely to choose to make to our society. Race is a factor in the admissions process, but not, in any case, a decisive element. Let me tell you another reason why more rigid approaches, such as that used by Texas, are unacceptable. The landscape of America is constantly changing. That, indeed, is one of the great sources of strength of our country. Certain ethnic groups that were barely represented in major law schools 10 years ago now form vibrant parts of our community. South Asian Americans, Americans of Middle Eastern origin, Korean Americans, new Americans from the countries of the former Soviet Union are all now significant parts of the law school population. Affirmative action must never be structured so that it builds unresponsive rigidities into the admissions process. I do think, though, we need to distinguish between so-called racial preferences and race-conscious decision-making. Race-blind decision-making can only be fully justified if we are quite certain that the criteria being applied are race-neutral. Information reported on the LSAT suggests that it is not race-neutral, that is, that some groups score less or more than others. Now, if no affirmative action is to be allowed, the question is what then will be the permissible basis of admissions decision? The answer is generally something called merit, but that again is a fairly slippery term without agreed content. Is an LSAT score or even an undergraduate GPA merit? Does a high score on a standardized test create some entitlement to scarce societal resources? Is it legal to use such measures if the net effect is to discriminate against members of minority groups? And to what extent are we trying to predict something as opposed to determining some pre-existing question of merit. At Columbia, we receive well over 5,000 applications for 350 places. Should we be constrained in admitting to a class, should we be constrained in admitting a class only those who we would predict will do extremely well? Or may we admit a class all of whose members are capable of doing the work, but who will all contribute different things both to the school and to our world? These issues go directly to the question of what we perceive to be the educational mission of a law school. Our mission is not simply to select the students who will receive the best grades. Our mission is to provide the best education we can for a group of students who think they have the best capacity to make, who we think have the best capacity to make use of that education, not only for the good of themselves, but for the good of all of us. What does this policy, which encourages the diversity of our student body, cost us in terms of the quality of that student body? Nothing. Our median LSAT at Columbia is the third highest in the country. Everyone, we admit, is capable of doing the work without any special assistance, and virtually all pass the bar examination on their first attempt. The diversity of our students is represented in the many fields in which they have achieved success. Our role in training leaders reflects the diversity of our student body. One thing we can be sure of, our leaders of tomorrow will come from every segment of our society. I just came from Seattle, where I met the mayor, who is a Columbia Law School graduate. He happens to be a white male. He thought he was the recipient of affirmative action because he came to Columbia from Iowa. One of our graduates in Washington, D.C. is a Supreme Court justice. She happens to be a woman. Another graduate in the Capitol is the CEO of Washington Gas. He happens to be black. Two of the highest officials in the Justice Department are Columbia graduates. One is Asian and the other is black. Many of the most visible people in various civil rights groups are Columbia graduates, including the former head of the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. We intend to continue to play an important role in training this country's leaders, and that means training those we think have the greatest potential from all of our many vibrant communities. We see that mission as geographically broad, ethnically broad, and broad in terms of social objectives and perspectives. Success in achieving diversity does not end with an admissions decision. An important component of a successful admissions strategy is getting the admitted students to come. Part of our success at Columbia is not only that our historic commitment to the diversity of our student body begets more diversity, but that we are also known as a school in which one can pursue with both fellow students and faculty a full range of interests. We have the best faculty in corporate law in the country, but we also have the best faculty interested in questions of race and the law. We hire that faculty based on one criterion: their proven or potential excellence as scholars and teachers. We have a strongly pluralistic vision of the kinds of scholars we seek to have represented on our faculty. The result of a diversity-oriented admissions program, a curriculum of substantial interest to all who comprise the group of students we seek, and aggressive recruitment is the most diverse student body among the most highly ranked law schools in the country. We take pride in what we have achieved, and pride especially in that we do it without sacrificing our rigorous standards. Let me conclude by summarizing a few points. The law as it now stands leaves plenty of room for private educational institutions to pursue a diverse student body. What then does an appropriate and legal diversity policy consist of? First, there must not be cutoffs for any group of applicants unless they are applied to all groups of applicants. Second, applicants, and especially certain groups of applicants must not be judged in isolation from one another, even while they are evaluated individually. Third, there must be a coherent goal of an admissions policy that goes beyond any individualized, merit-oriented decisions. Fourth, all students must be fully capable of doing the work. And finally, as I said, there must be effective recruitment. We cannot, I think, afford to return to the days of segregation. If our history does not teach us that avoiding segregation is a compelling interest that justifies some race-conscious decision-making, I am not sure what we have learned from the past 100 years. Whatever the restraints may be on government institutions under the Constitution, I think it would be absurd to interfere with private actors who apply reasonable race-conscious policies to achieve diversity. Precedent suggests that this is indeed the law. The notion today that such private institutions seeking a diverse student body should be prohibited from considering race, while free to consider a plethora of other variables with dubious relationship to any notion of merit, ignores every reality we know about American society today. As in many other contexts, our private institutions must be permitted to make their contribution to the good of our society. And there can be little doubt that increased equality, increased opportunity among all segments of our society, and increased understanding between those six segments are such positive contributions. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. You alluded to this, and in fact came at the end of your speech, you addressed it directly, but I'd like to give you a chance to expand on it a little bit. Terrence Powell is the senior counsel for an organization called Center for Individual Rights. It's an organization that opposes affirmative action. When shown the substantial decline in minority students at UCLA and University of California at Berkeley since Proposition 209, he made two comments. Number one shouldn't be obsessed with individual year statistics, and secondly, diversity is important. The challenge is how to get at it without focusing on skin color. And I'd like you, as a dean of a major law school, to comment on those two statements.
Well, the first one I'll agree with. That is, that one shouldn't focus on a single year's statistics. I think that's a mistake in any context. And one would perhaps agree with the aspiration of the second statement, that is, how does one get that diversity without focusing on any one criterion? We don't focus on any one criterion. We look at every student as a whole and compare every student that we seek to admit in some sense to every other students. That's why we have a highly professional staff capable of keeping 5,500 applications in mind simultaneously. But if the suggestion is that in the world that we see it as today, one can achieve that diversity without some race-conscious decision-making, it is mistaken unless, of course, we simply abandon the criteria that are in fact not race-neutral. So one way to achieve that diversity we could abandon reliance on the LSAT. The proposal in Texas, of course, was simply to admit to the University of Texas the top 10%, that is to the college, the top 10% from each high school in Texas. That's one way one could do it. That's not a very good solution for a lot of reasons and creates a lot of adverse behavior, such as students deciding to go to less good, less well-financed schools in minority districts rather than take opportunities to go to better schools because the chances of admission will be better. Admissions decisions are very complex. I want to agree that admissions decisions should not be made on one variable. It is quite a different thing, I think, to say that that variable should be completely irrelevant to the decision-making process when other variables, for example, whether the applicant is the son or daughter of a graduate of the institution, whether the applicant comes from Oregon rather than New Jersey. All of those things are relevant in our admissions process because we think they are helpful to constructing not only a class, which will be interesting to us as a faculty and to the students, but because we think we do our best work when we train our students to go forth to every community in this country.
Greg McPherson, City Club member. Dean Leebron, don't construe any significance to the fact that I'm standing at a microphone that has the word against draped over it. My question is this. Some minority groups believe they're discriminated against in the admissions process despite having better credentials than the general applicant pool. In the past, some have asserted that prestigious institutions in this country limited the number of Jewish admittees, and similar kinds of assertions have been made in the more recent past about Asian Americans. Does your strategy of building a diverse class at Columbia mean limiting the number of admittees from minority groups whose qualifications exceed the norm?
No, I don't think there's been any experience with that at all. We've had a rising number of Asian American applicants, and that number is reflected in those who choose to come to Columbia. Many of those students choose to come to Columbia because we have such strong programs in Asian law, for example, and we seek to attract all of those students that we can. I think one thing I want to stress is the importance of having an admissions process which does not segregate parts of that decision-making process. I think that kind of a decision-making process leads to quotas, and I've seen that at other institutions. That is, if you have a separate minority committee that considers minority applications, which is separate from the process for majority applications, often the only way that process can work is for the people in the separate committee to understand there's some goal or quota to achieve. So I think it's essential in achieving a diverse student body that one not do that, so all of the applicants, with all of whatever each applicant can bring, competes in some sense with every other applicant.
Tom Kuhn, City Club member. My ears perked up when I heard $25,000 a year. And you also mentioned that you have a recruitment process. I was wondering if part of your recruitment process included some financial way of helping these students to help gain the diversity of your student population.
I guess $25,000 does seem like a lot of money. We do a number of things. One, like most other institutions, we provide scholarship aid. We also expect our students to undertake very substantial debt obligations because most of them will, in fact, enter fairly lucrative careers that will enable them, really without too much hardship, to repay those debt obligations. So first, on the front end, we want to make sure it's possible for each and every student. Our financial aid policies do not take into account race in any way whatsoever, or sex, or any of those other variables. It is based solely on financial need. So we look at the student and we say, we think you can borrow a certain amount of money, and we say, if that's not enough, we will provide scholarship aid. 3 years later, the student graduates, often with a law school debt that could be $60,000, and an undergraduate debt which could bring that total debt to over $100,000. That, for our students, from the majority of them which enter into the private practice of law, is still a sustainable debt burden. But for many students, and especially those students who choose, for example, to do public interest work or government work, they would not be able to afford to repay their loans. So we have a program which we call the Loan Repayment Assistance Program, in which the law school provides the money to the student to repay the loans, and if the student remains in public interest or public service work for a significant period of time, the law school then essentially forgives those loans, so that it's a kind of after-the-fact scholarship as opposed to before-the-fact scholarship. We think there needs to be more resources for both of those programs, but together I think they make it possible for every student who really wants to both to afford the law school education and, we hope, after the education to afford the career of his or her choice.
Hi, Ilya Popovich, City Club member. Recognizing the law's, I think, legitimate suspicion of subjective decision-making, where it's been used to discriminate in the past, I'm wondering if you're aware of any objective yardsticks that you could use to measure the benefit of a diverse student body.
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. Is there an objective way to measure the benefit of the diversity of the student body?
Right. I mean, it seems like a horribly complicated task, but one that might need to be done in the face of increased regulation in this area.
Yeah, I don't know how one objectively measures the value of diversity any more than one measures objectively the value of coming to a forum such as this, or going to a museum, or seeing a good show or movie. I think we as a society believe that all of our members and communities contribute some value to that society. I think at Columbia we see in a classroom, through the interaction and diversity, the values of that. That is, people engage intellectually in issues, foster the classroom discussion. I can tell you, one can observe diversity not working when people don't talk to each other. That is, if you have a diversity policy which simply creates sort of separate groups in a law school or other environment that don't communicate with each other, that don't learn from each other, and that are hostile to each other, that's not a productive diversity policy. Our experience has been just the opposite, that people are engaged, that they talk with each other, that they learn from each other, that it stimulates not only the classroom environment, but the environment outside law school, outside the classroom. Essential to that is making sure that all students feel welcome and fairly treated in that environment. A diversity policy will fail if one brings to an institution people of diverse interests and fails to service or respond to those interests. So as I say, we have a full range of courses that we try to respond to every group. I had a group of Asian American students come to my office a couple years ago, and they wanted a course in something they called Asian American jurisprudence. And we didn't have anybody to teach such a course, but one of my colleagues agreed to supervise a course, and the students themselves organized the course and invited people to come and lecture and talk with the students, and made that course another part of the Columbia Law School experience that responded to their particular interest to some extent, with something which I think was also of interest and valuable to other members of the community.
Corleen Kraft, City Club member. I'd like to ask two questions, since it appears I don't have much competition for the microphone. First is that your enlightened policy is very admirable, but if you would hope that private universities would not be regulated in the same way as the public universities, that presupposes that all of the private universities in the country share your enlightened approach. Is that in fact the case? And my second question then is, have you given any thought to what kind of policy would be a good policy for public universities?
I don't presuppose that every private institution will share our particular goals. We're a law school located in the largest and I think most diverse city in this country. We have a mission going back many years. Paul Robeson was one of our graduates in 1923, I believe. I don't, in some sense, think that's the issue. It may be my hope. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think it would be very odd if we suppressed the opportunity for private educational institutions to make the kinds of contributions to our society they think are most called for. I'm not necessarily an advocate of mandating that all private institutions engage in affirmative action. I do think they should be prohibited from discriminatory policies that disadvantage various groups. But I suppose there may be many institutions which choose not to engage in such policies. For our history and at our time, we think this is a very important part of our mission. As for public institutions, my own view would be that we ought to find ways to allow such institutions to continue to service a diverse population. There are a number of different ways to do that. I think one is that those institutions may respond by relying substantially less on the so-called objective criteria which are at the root of the sort of most discriminatory aspects of the admissions policy. This is a debate in terms of public institutions which is far from over, because the next step in that debate will be what are the appropriate criteria for admissions if indeed one cannot in any way take race into account in those institutions. But I also want to say there are many aspects in our society in which we think the government is bound by one set of policies and private institutions by another. A government educational institution is much more constrained in its ability to regulate sort of the ideas or beliefs of faculty or students and what they publish, for example. A private institution may choose to have a more active role in that context, to say it only wants faculty of a certain kind of perspective, that it wants to build a faculty with a certain kind of viewpoint on the world. That's the way our society is constructed. And I think it's important to realize, both legally and more broadly, that whatever constraints we think are best to put on actors affiliated with the government may not be appropriate for actors in the private, especially charitable sector.
Sid Lazak, member. I can't remember a speaker with whom I've agreed so completely, so you can relax for my question. But I'm still troubled by an argument that is made that affirmative action programs and the perception of what those programs do create a discrimination against the minority student who is highly qualified and could make it on his own. The old argument, do you want to be operated on by a brain surgeon who may have gotten in, who was less qualified than others? And I just like your best argument against that. I know I'm still for what you say, but it's a troubling problem.
Well, I think some of that comes from using policies such as Texas, in which you say to the world, well, if you're this group, your standards are X, and if you're that group, your standards are Y. I also think it critically important that one only admits students capable of doing the work. And by capable of doing the work, I don't mean barely passing. I mean with a reasonable expectation that they will do very solid work at the institution without substantial additional support. That is our approach. We only admit those students who we think, when they come, will perform excellently. I think one way that law schools in Columbia help this along a little bit is through our system of anonymous grading. Once you arrive at Columbia, have that wonderful law school experience in which you sit in the classroom and the professor calls on you and forces you to talk publicly about your ideas. At the end of that course, you take an examination, and you're assigned a number, and that exam is graded anonymously, and you get whatever grade that you get at that point in time. I think that's one of the reasons we know our approach is successful. I mean, it so happens, one of the best performers in my class last year was an African American. I didn't know that until after I had anonymously submitted the grades. Somebody else told me, who had gotten what grade, and I wasn't surprised because the student had impressed me from the beginning. But I think one does need to be very careful about that. I think both in terms of the process for admission, that we don't stigmatize certain groups. But I think all of this should be against is we don't quite know what it is these standardized tests predict, and we don't know that they predict the same thing for all the different groups of people that take these standardized tests. And most important, we don't know that they predict how effective and successful one will be in their chosen career, and in this, for us, that mostly, but not always, means as a lawyer.
I'm Charlie Hinkle, member. I'd like to go back to the question or the issue of diversity for a moment. There was a question about it a while ago, and you mentioned it with respect to the Hopwood decision. And I'd like to hear you explore a little bit more the question of whether diversity in itself might not be a virtue, and why is it that more people don't see that. It strikes me that Norway is a wonderful country, but it's full mostly of Norwegians. And one reason that America, the United States of America, may be a stronger society and a stronger nation is that we not only have Norwegians, but we have a lot of other Europeans and a lot of Africans and a lot of Asians. If by some quirk of fate the 9 most brilliant lawyers in the country all happen to be Presbyterian Republican females from Peoria, we still wouldn't want those 9 people to be on our Supreme Court. We would want some Catholics and some Jews and some Southerners and some New Englanders and some Westerners. I mean, it goes without saying, it seems to me, that even Justice Rehnquist believes in diversity on the U.S. Supreme Court, although maybe he'd like to have 9 Rehnquists, I don't know. But why, I mean, is there really any conceivable defense for the Fifth Circuit saying diversity is not a legitimate governmental goal?
Well, I'm sorry, that's not what they said. They didn't say it was not a legitimate governmental goal. They said it was not a compelling state interest that would justify race-conscious decision-making. Or in the Texas case, you know, what really in Texas did look like what one might call preferences to some degree. Now, what we do at Columbia is very much different than that. So they weren't rejecting diversity as a government goal. They were suggesting it should be achieved through other means. I have some doubt that in the world that we see today, without understanding, I think one thing we always have to recognize is how ignorant we are, how much we don't know about explaining why certain groups are doing well or not well, how ignorant we are about what an LSAT really measures, and how certain groups why certain groups may or may not do well on those tests. I think in that context of ignorance, we ought to consciously pursue a goal of diversity. And I think for a number of different reasons. One, we, as a very old charitable institution, administer a very valuable resource that is some of the best educational opportunities in this country. I think it's our responsibility to fairly distribute that resource. That fairness, I think, has many aspects to it. One of them is indeed merit, but that's not the only measure by which one fairly distributes resources. And I would add to that, of course, that we're very confused in many ways about what is or what is not merit. So it's not a question of saying diversity is not a value. I think all of the courts would say that diversity is a value. The question is whether you can get to that point with race-conscious decisions. And then that depends on how one interprets, in the case of public institutions, the Constitution of the United States, and in the case of private institutions, statutes enacted by Congress. I think it would be very odd, particularly in the case of statutes, to say that statutes enacted to assure the civil rights, especially of minority individuals, we are now going to interpret to prohibit the use of the goal of diversity to assure that those groups are well represented in our various educational institutions.
Hi, Stella Minabe with the Oregon State Bar. Because of Oregon's history and demographics, the Oregon law schools depend a great deal on ethnic minority prospects from out of state. Thus, its recruiting is a huge component of the admissions process. Besides having your name recognition, which is a built-in recruiting tool, what does Columbia do to attract ethnic minority prospects?
Well, we do a number of things. I think we do find that all kinds of groups are more likely to come to a school in which they feel they will be in a community that is supportive. Now, for Columbia, that means not only African Americans or Asian Americans, it also means Mormon Americans or Americans from Texas or Southern California. All of those are groups fairly well represented at the law school. The second thing is to assure that there's a program of interest to those students and they find it a supportive and tolerant environment. And the third is direct outreach, of conveying to students you care about them, and we do that both on the staff level. One of our admissions deans is also a dean for minority recruitment, and she pays particular attention to these issues. But the most effective thing always is to use students. And if the students are happy and comfortable in the environment, they will do what they can to recruit other students. So we bring students to the school for Admitted Students Day and establish those connections and encourage our various student groups to reach out to all of the students who are admitted who might be interested in those particular groups.
Harriet Watson, City Club member. One of the historically underrepresented groups I didn't hear you mention were the Native American students, and maybe that's something of more concern to those of us in the West, though I think not. And now that issues relating to tribal jurisdiction are emerging on the public policy agenda along with local, state, and federal issues of jurisdiction, what, if any, discussions are you having at Columbia, both in terms of admission and curriculum?
We are actually very interested in recruiting Native American students. We've been more successful than most law schools on the East Coast. We have had, not every year, but many years, courses in Native American law and tried to build a small but still vibrant community of Native American students. There the numbers are small so that each year can make quite a big difference, whether you have 1 student, 3 students, or 5 students, so that one over 3 years could create a good community is difficult. We've now actually working, we support, for example, our Native American students in attending sort of conferences of Native American students because we feel that's a good outreach and it's a way for us to convey to Native Americans around the country that this is a matter of particular interest to us. We just happen to be exploring now at the law school other ways in which we might do that. We received recently a gift which will be used in connection with our loan repayment assistance program, specifically for students who go out after law school to work for organizations interested in servicing the Native American community. So we think programs like that will eventually attract support. I also hope that some of course, the Native American tribes are doing quite well in various endeavors in their separate jurisdictions. And we hope that some of those resources will eventually be turned to providing support for Native American students to attend law schools, and particularly the best law schools. I mean, we would pick Columbia, of course, but I'm slightly biased in that regard. But we think there are really very substantial opportunities on the East Coast in particular. I think there's been a concentration here of many students out here, Stanford and some other schools for Native Americans. We think with the rise in sort of consciousness among Native Americans in the eastern part of the United States, there are important opportunities to be pursued, and we hope Columbia will be an important part of that.
Thank you. We appreciate your remarks. Hopefully we'll see that the experiences recently in Texas and California are aberrations and not a trend for the future. Please be with us next week, May 15th.